The valley was silent in the way only dead places are. No birds, no wind, just the low hum of distant rotors and the crackling of radios that had gone unanswered for 11 minutes. 11 minutes since Viper 6 had called for immediate extraction. 11 minutes since the mountainside had erupted with gunfire and the entire operation had collapsed into chaos. Now, somewhere in that maze of rock and shadow, 8 Navy SEALs were pinned down, bleeding and running out of time. The operations center at Bagram was a controlled panic. Screens glowed with thermal signatures and drone feeds that showed nothing useful, just smoke, dust, and the occasional muzzle flash from enemy positions dug so deep into the canyon walls, they might as well have been part of the stone itself. The officer in charge, a colonel with 20 years of combat command under his belt, stood with his arms crossed, staring at the map like it might offer a solution it hadn't given him in the last 10 minutes. Apache gunships were 12 minutes out. The QRF was grounded by weather over the ridge, and the enemy knew it. That's when the radio crackled with a voice no one expected. Calm, almost bored. Bagram, this is Widow 11, inbound on your 6 with 30 mic and a full loadout. Say position of friendlies. Every head in the room turned. The colonel's jaw tightened. He keyed his mic. Widow 11, say again your call sign and aircraft type. A-10C Thunderbolt, sir. Single ship. Already made my turn, just need the grid. There was a pause. Someone in the back of the room muttered something that might have been a curse or a prayer. The A-10 was a relic, a flying tank built in the 70s, slow, ugly, loud, and in a canyon that narrow with that much incoming fire it was a coffin with wings. The colonel exhaled through his nose. Widow 11, be advised the LZ is hot. Multiple technical positions, possible MA and PADS, 0 air support. Apache are 12 mics out. Recommend you hold station. The reply came back without hesitation. Negative, Bagram. Viper 6 doesn't have 12 minutes. And that was it. No argument, no bravado, just a statement of fact delivered in a voice that sounded like it had made this kind of call before. The colonel looked at the screen, then at his air boss, who shrugged with the kind of resignation that comes from knowing you're out of options. He gave the grid. Widow 11 copied and went silent. For 30 seconds, no one in the operations center spoke. Then, from the drone feed, a shadow moved across the ridgeline. Low, fast, painted in desert gray and bristling with ordnance. The A-10 dropped into the canyon like a stone, wings level, nose down, and didn't pull up. She flew through the mouth of the canyon at 400 feet, the twin turbofans screaming against the rock walls, and the first thing anyone on the ground heard was the sound. Not the engines, not the rotors. The sound of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon spooling up, a deep, guttural roar that turned the air itself into a weapon. The gun didn't just fire, it tore. 65 rounds per second, each one the size of a beer bottle, walking a line of destruction across the enemy positions dug into the eastern ridge. Dust and debris exploded outward in a cloud that blotted out the sun. The technicals, modified pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, didn't explode so much as disintegrate, torn apart by a weapon designed to kill Soviet tanks. Inside the canyon, the SEALs pressed themselves flat against the rocks, ears ringing from the overpressure, as the A-10 pulled up hard, banking vertical along the cliffside, so close that one of the men later swore he could see rivets on the fuselage. Then it rolled inverted, lit its afterburners, which the A-10 didn't have, but it felt like it did, and came back around for another pass. This time it wasn't the gun, it was the Mavericks, 2 of them launched in rapid succession, streaking toward targets that had been invisible to drones and satellite. The first missile punched into a cave opening and detonated deep inside the rock, collapsing half the ridgeline. The second hit a fortified position near the canyon's choke point, and the explosion sent a fireball rolling up the cliff face. The enemy fire didn't stop. It evaporated. Widow 11 didn't call for clearance, didn't ask for permission. She just kept coming, pass after pass, carving a path through the kill zone with a precision that bordered on surgical, despite the fact that she was flying a 30-ton gun platform through a space barely wide enough for a helicopter. She spoke only twice more, once to confirm friendly positions, once to tell Viper 6 to pop smoke when they were ready for extract. The SEALs didn't pop smoke. They spray-painted a makeshift landing zone with what they had and dragged their wounded into the open, trusting that the woman in the sky who just saved their lives knew what she was doing. She did. The A-10 made one final pass, this time with flares spitting from its belly to draw off any remaining threats, and held station overhead while the Apache finally arrived and the extraction birds came in low. Only after the last man was aboard did Widow 1-1 pull up, climb out of the canyon, and disappear into the haze. Back at Bagram, the colonel stood in silence, staring at the screen. Someone finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Who the hell was that? The air boss pulled up the flight roster, scrolled down, and stopped. He blinked. Then he turned the screen around. The name on the manifest was Captain Renata Kovac. Call sign, Widow, 32 years old, former Marine Corps aviator, transferred to the Air Force after a medical discharge that had apparently been overturned. 400 combat hours in the Harrier before the switch, and a service record that looked like it had been redacted in 3 different places. The colonel stared at the name. He'd never heard of her. No one had. And yet she'd just done what an entire air wing hadn't been able to do in 11 minutes. He leaned back, rubbed his face, and muttered something under his breath that might have been respect or disbelief. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Where is she now? Landing, the air boss replied. Requested immediate rearm and refuel. For what? She said there's another patrol in Sector 4 that might need her. The room went quiet again. The colonel nodded once slowly and turned back to the screen. Let her fly. Renata Kovac didn't taxi to the main ramp. She rolled her A-10 into a far corner of the airfield, away from the newer jets and the pilots who flew them, and shut down her engines without fanfare. The ground crew jogged over, already prepping for the rearm, and she climbed down from the cockpit with the kind of mechanical efficiency that comes from doing the same thing 1,000 times. Her flight suit was soaked through with sweat. Her helmet left a red line across her forehead. And her hands didn't shake, not once. One of the crew chiefs, a staff sergeant with grease under his nails and a toothpick in his mouth, looked up at the scorched barrels of the GAU-8 and whistled low. Ma'am, how many rounds you put through this thing? Enough, Renata said, pulling off her gloves. You catch any fire? Some. MANPADS. Probably. The crew chief grinned. Probably. He shook his head and slapped the side of the aircraft like it was a loyal dog. This bird's older than me. Surprised she didn't fall apart. Renata glanced at the A-10, its nose streaked with cordite burns, its wings pockmarked with shrapnel, and felt something close to affection. She's tougher than she looks. Like her pilot, the sergeant said, and Renata didn't reply because she didn't know what to say to that. She just nodded, grabbed her checklist, and walked toward the debrief room, where she knew no one would be waiting. Because they never were. She'd been flying for the 163rd Expeditionary Fighter Squadron for 8 months, and in that time she'd flown more close air support missions than anyone else in the unit. Not because she was the best, not because she was the most experienced, but because she was the only one willing to take the calls that everyone else turned down, the ones that came in the middle of the night, the ones with no backup. The ones where the friendly positions were so close to the enemy that a single miscalculation would mean blue-on-blue casualties and a career-ending investigation. Renata took those calls because she understood something the younger pilots didn't. That hesitation killed people. That doubt was a luxury you couldn't afford when someone on the ground was counting seconds until they died. And that the only thing that mattered, the only thing that ever mattered, was bringing them home. The debrief room was empty except for a lieutenant from intelligence who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He asked the standard questions: targets engaged, munitions expended, battle damage assessment, and Renata answered in clipped, factual sentences that gave him nothing to work with. When he asked if she'd taken fire, she said yes. When he asked if she'd been hit, she said no. When he asked if she wanted to file an after-action report, she said it wasn't necessary. He looked at her like she was crazy. Maybe she was. She left before he could ask anything else. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful if they didn't remind her of fire. Renata stood on the flight line, hands in her pockets, and watched the shadows lengthen across the runway. Somewhere in the distance, another A-10 was taking off, its engines roaring, and she felt the vibration in her chest like a second heartbeat. Her radio buzzed, a message from ops, another patrol, another call, another canyon. She turned and walked back toward her aircraft, where the crew chief was still working, and she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. She just climbed back into the cockpit, strapped in, and started the pre-flight checks all over again. Because that's what Widow did. That's what she'd always done. The story of Renata Kovac didn't start in Afghanistan. It started 8 years earlier, in a hangar at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, where a 24-year-old lieutenant with something to prove stood in front of an AV-8B Harrier for the first time, and felt the weight of every doubt that had been placed on her shoulders since the day she'd signed her commissioning papers. Women had been flying combat aircraft for years by then, but that didn't mean the culture had caught up. It didn't mean the jokes stopped. It didn't mean the older pilots stopped watching her like she was a ticking clock, waiting for the moment she'd prove them right. Renata had heard them all, too emotional, too fragile, too distracted. She'd heard them whispered in ready rooms and muttered behind her back, and she'd learned early on that the only response that mattered was the one she gave in the cockpit. So she flew. She flew harder, longer, and more precisely than anyone expected, and she did it without complaining, without asking for help, and without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her fail. Her instructors had been split. Half of them thought she was reckless. The other half thought she was gifted. Both sides agreed that she didn't fly like a student. She flew like someone who'd been doing it for years, with an instinct for altitude and angle that couldn't be taught. She could feel the aircraft in a way most pilots never did, feel its weight shift, its engines respond, its airframe flex under stress. And when she flew close air support in training, she could put ordnance on target with a margin of error measured in feet, not meters. But instinct wasn't enough. Not in the Marines. Not in a community where reputation mattered more than skill and where one mistake could define a career. Renata made that mistake in her 3rd year. It was a routine training mission over the Carolinas. Low-level flight, simulated attack runs, and a target range that was supposed to be clear. It wasn't. A civilian hiker had wandered into the restricted area, and by the time Renata saw him, she was already committed to the run. She aborted, pulled up hard, dumped her ordnance in the safe zone, and called it off. No one was hurt. The mission was scrubbed. And when she landed, she was met by her commanding officer and told that she'd violated procedure by not confirming the range was clear before beginning her approach. She tried to explain, tried to say that the range control had cleared her, that she'd followed protocol, but it didn't matter. Someone had to take the fall, and it wasn't going to be the officer who'd made the call. It was going to be the lieutenant who'd been too aggressive, too confident, too eager to prove herself. The paperwork said poor judgment. The informal report said she'd panicked. And just like that, her reputation changed. She wasn't Renata Kovac, the gifted pilot. She was Renata Kovac, the one who screwed up. 6 months later, she was medically discharged after a hard landing in a training exercise left her with a compression fracture in her lower back. The doctors said she'd heal, that she'd be able to walk, run, even exercise. But flying combat aircraft, that required a level of physical resilience she might not get back. The Marines didn't fight it. They processed her out quietly, with a handshake and a thank you for your service that felt like a door closing. Renata spent a year in physical therapy, rebuilding herself one painful session at a time, and when she was finally cleared for flight duty again, the Marines didn't want her back. So she went to the Air Force. She retrained, requalified, and when they asked her what aircraft she wanted to fly, she didn't hesitate. The A-10. Because it wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty, and no one expected anything from it. Just like her. The transition wasn't easy. The A-10 flew differently than the Harrier, heavier, slower, less maneuverable, but it was tougher. It could take hits that would down any other aircraft and keep flying. It could loiter over a battlefield for hours, waiting for the moment it was needed. And when that moment came, it could deliver violence with a precision that made grown men weep with relief. Renata loved it. She loved the way it felt in her hands, solid and unshakable. She loved the way it sounded, that deep, throaty roar of the engines that announced her arrival like a promise. And she loved the way it scared people, not the enemy, though it did that too, but the people on her own side who thought she was crazy for flying it. The same people who called it a dinosaur, who said it should have been retired decades ago, who didn't understand that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. She didn't try to convince them, she just flew. And slowly, quietly, she built a reputation again, not as the lieutenant who screwed up, not as the woman who didn't belong, but as Widow, the pilot who came when no one else would, the pilot who flew through the kind of fire that made other pilots turn back, the pilot who brought people home. The call sign had come from her first mission in Afghanistan. A patrol had been ambushed near the border, and the radio chatter had been frantic, desperate, full of voices that were trying not to scream. Renata had taken the call before anyone else could respond, and when she'd arrived, the enemy positions had been so close to the friendlies that the controller on the ground had asked, his voice shaking, if she was sure she could make the shot. She'd replied with 2 words, "Trust me." And she'd made the shot, all of them. 6 gun runs, each one closer than the last, each one walking the line between salvation and disaster. When it was over, the patrol was alive, and the controller had keyed his mic one last time, his voice hoarse, and said, "Widow 11, you just made a lot of wives very happy." The call sign stuck, not because it was clever, but because it was true. She was the Widowmaker, the one who sent the enemy home in boxes, the one who gave the living a reason to believe they'd see another sunrise. And over time, as the missions piled up and the stories spread, the name became something more. It became a promise, a guarantee, a legend whispered in ready rooms and operations centers across the theater. If you called for Widow, she'd come. No matter what. But legends have a cost, and Renata paid hers every night, alone in her quarters, staring at the ceiling and replaying every mission in her mind, every shot, every pass, every moment where she'd been 1 degree off from disaster. She didn't sleep well, didn't talk much, didn't let anyone close enough to see the cracks forming under the surface. Because if they saw the cracks, they'd start to doubt, and if they doubted, they'd stop calling, and if they stopped calling, people would die. So she kept flying. The second mission came 3 days after the canyon. This time, it was a convoy ambushed on the highway outside Kandahar, a long, exposed stretch of road with no cover and nowhere to run. The enemy had set the trap perfectly, using an IED to disable the lead vehicle, and then opening up from both sides with machine guns and RPGs. The convoy had called for air support within seconds, but the weather was bad, visibility was low, and every available aircraft was either grounded or committed elsewhere. Except Widow 11. Renata launched into a sky choked with dust and haze, the kind of conditions that made visual navigation nearly impossible. She flew low, using her terrain-following radar and sheer instinct to navigate the mountain passes, and when she finally spotted the convoy, it was already surrounded. Vehicles burning, bodies on the ground, the kind of scene that stayed with you long after the smoke cleared. She didn't wait for clearance. She rolled in hot, lining up her first gun run by memory and feel, and walked the cannon fire across the enemy positions with a precision that defied the conditions. The A-10 shuddered with each burst, the nose dipping slightly from the recoil, and she compensated without thinking, adjusting her angle mid-pass to keep the rounds on target. The enemy scattered, tried to regroup. She didn't let them. She came back around, this time with rockets, and painted the ridgeline with high-explosive death. Then she circled overhead, her fuel running low, her ammunition nearly spent, and she stayed until the QRF arrived and every last soldier was accounted for. When she landed, the ground crew found 14 holes in her aircraft. Small arms fire. One round had punched through the tail section, missing a hydraulic line by inches. Another had struck the left engine cowling but hadn't penetrated. The crew chief looked at her like she'd walked through a minefield blindfolded. "Ma'am, you didn't report battle damage." "Didn't seem important," Renata said, already walking away. "Didn't seem." The sergeant stopped, shook his head, and muttered something under his breath that sounded like a mix of admiration and disbelief. The convoy commander sent a message through channels that night. Short, simple, it said, "Tell Widow we owe her, all of us." Renata never replied. Weeks passed. The missions kept coming. A fire base under siege. A downed helicopter crew surrounded by hostiles. A village occupied by insurgents with civilians trapped inside. Every time the call came in the same way, urgent, desperate, and always with the same caveat: no other assets available. And every time Renata launched, flew into hell, and came back with her aircraft held together by rivets and prayer. The other pilots started to notice, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't ignore it. The mission board in the operations center tracked every sortie, every pilot, every result. And Widow 11's column kept growing while everyone else's stayed relatively static. At first, they chalked it up to luck. Then they chalked it up to recklessness. Then they stopped making excuses and started asking questions. "Who is she?" a young captain asked one night in the chow hall, staring at the mission summary. "A-10 pilot," someone replied. "I know that, but who is she? Where'd she come from?" No one had an answer, or if they did, they weren't saying. Because the truth was, Renata Kovac existed in a kind of gray space in the unit. She wasn't part of the social fabric, didn't drink with the other pilots, didn't join the poker games or the gym sessions or the late-night conversations about home. She showed up, flew, and disappeared. And the only time anyone saw her was when she was walking to or from her aircraft, head down, lost in thought. Some of the pilots resented her for it, thought she was arrogant, thought she was trying to make them look bad. Others were just curious, wanted to know how she did it, how she flew through situations that would make experienced pilots balk and came out the other side like it was routine. One of them finally worked up the courage to ask. His name was Captain Elias Thorne, a former F-16 pilot who transitioned to the A-10 after a decade of flying fighters. He was good, everyone said so, but he was also smart enough to recognize when someone was better. And Widow was better. He caught her one evening on the flight line, just as she was finishing her post-flight checks, and he didn't waste time with small talk. "How do you do it?" he asked. Renata looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Do what?" "Fly like that, the canyon, the convoy, that village op last week where you put a Maverick through a window from 2 miles out. How do you do it?" She was quiet for a long moment, and Thorne thought she might just walk away. But then she spoke, her voice low and even. "I don't think about what could go wrong. I think about what will happen if I don't try." "That's it. That's it." Thorne frowned. "That's not a technique, that's a philosophy." "Maybe," Renata said, "but it works." She turned to leave, and Thorne called after her, "You ever get scared?" She stopped, didn't turn around, and when she answered, her voice was quieter than before. "Every time." Then she walked away, leaving Thorne standing on the flight line, staring after her. And for the first time since he'd met her, he understood. She wasn't fearless. She was just more afraid of failing than she was of dying. The mission that changed everything came in late November. A special forces team had been conducting reconnaissance deep in the mountains near the Pakistani border when they'd stumbled into a hornet's nest. What was supposed to be a small enemy outpost turned out to be a staging area for a much larger force, and within minutes, the team was outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting for their lives. They called for immediate extract, but the terrain was brutal: steep ridges, narrow valleys, and no clear landing zone. Helicopters couldn't get in, fast movers couldn't stay long enough to make a difference, and the enemy knew it. The team leader, a master sergeant with a voice like gravel, made the call himself. Any station, this is Reaper 2. We are in heavy contact, taking casualties, need immediate air support. Grid follows. The response was silence, then static, then, finally, a voice that every operator in the theater had started to recognize. Reaper 2, Widow 1-1. I'm 15 mics out, hold tight. The master sergeant didn't reply. He didn't have to. He just keyed his mic twice, an acknowledgement, and went back to shooting. Renata pushed her A-10 to the edge of its performance envelope, flying nap of the earth through mountain passes that didn't appear on any map, using nothing but terrain and instinct to navigate. When she finally reached the target area, she saw the situation immediately. The SF team was dug in on a ridgeline, surrounded on three sides, with enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. There was no margin for error, no room for hesitation, and no time to think. She rolled in from the north, lining up her first gun run on the largest concentration of enemy fighters, and opened up with the GAU-8. The cannon roared, spitting fire and death, and the enemy positions disintegrated. She pulled up, banked hard, and came back from the east, this time with rockets, tearing into a second group that had been trying to flank the SF team. Then she circled, looking for targets, and saw something that made her blood run cold. A pickup truck mounted with a heavy machine gun, was racing toward the ridgeline, and in the back she could see the unmistakable shape of a recoilless rifle. If it got into position, it would tear the SF team apart. She had seconds, maybe less. Renata rolled inverted, dove toward the valley floor, and leveled out barely 50 feet above the ground. The technical was moving fast, kicking up dust, and she had one shot, one chance. She squeezed the trigger, and the GAU-8 unleashed a torrent of rounds that walked across the ground and caught the technical mid-turn. The truck exploded in a fireball, the recoilless rifle tumbling through the air, and Renata pulled up so hard she felt the G-forces press her into her seat. She didn't celebrate, didn't pause. She just kept flying, marking targets, calling them out, and eliminating them one by one until the enemy fire slackened, then stopped. By the time the extract birds arrived, the battlefield was silent except for the sound of her engines circling overhead. The master sergeant keyed his mic one last time. Widow 1-1, Reaper 2, we're clear, that was something else. Renata's reply was calm, professional. Glad I could help, Reaper, stay safe. But inside, her hands were shaking. The after-action report from that mission made it all the way to the top, to the general in charge of air operations, to the Joint Special Operations Command, to people who made decisions about medals and commendations and who deserved recognition. And for the first time, Renata Kovac's name appeared in dispatches not as a footnote, but as the centerpiece. The SEALs who'd been in the canyon sent a bottle of whiskey to the 163rd with a note that said, "For Widow, from the guys who shouldn't be here." The SF team from the ridgeline sent a patch, a custom-made emblem with a widow spider and the words "Death from Above." The convoy commander sent a letter, handwritten, thanking her for saving his men. And slowly, the legend of Widow stopped being a rumor and became something real, something tangible, something that other pilots couldn't dismiss as luck or recklessness anymore. But with recognition came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came questions. The first one came from her squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel named Raymond Hale, who called her into his office 2 days after the Ridgeline mission. He was a career officer, a former F-15 pilot who'd moved into command after a distinguished flying career, and he had the kind of reputation that made junior officers stand a little straighter when he walked into a room. He gestured for Renata to sit, and she did, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. "Captain Kovac," Hale began, leaning back in his chair, "I've been reviewing your flight logs." "Yes, sir." "You've flown 42 close air support missions in the last 8 months. 42. That's more than any other pilot in this squadron. More than most pilots fly in an entire deployment." "Yes, sir." "And you've taken fire on 31 of those missions. 31. You've brought your aircraft back with battle damage 12 times. You've expended more ammunition than anyone else in the unit. And you've logged more flight hours than pilots with twice your time in theater." Renata said nothing, just waited. Hale leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "So my question is, why?" "Sir, why are you flying so much? Why are you taking missions that other pilots are passing on? Why are you putting yourself in situations that are borderline suicidal?" Renata met his gaze without flinching. "Because someone has to, sir." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." Hale studied her for a long moment, and Renata could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was trying to figure her out, trying to determine if she was a hero or a liability, trying to decide if she was an asset to the squadron or a problem waiting to explode. Finally, he sighed. "Captain, I'm not questioning your skill. Your results speak for themselves, but I am questioning your judgment. You can't keep flying like this. Eventually, your luck is going to run out." "It's not luck, sir." "Then what is it?" Renata hesitated. She could have said a lot of things, could have explained the hours of training, the instinct, the focus. But instead, she said the only thing that mattered. "It's what I'm good at." Hale didn't reply. He just looked at her, and for a moment, Renata thought he might ground her, might pull her from flight status and assign her to a desk somewhere safe, where she couldn't risk herself or her aircraft. But then he nodded slowly and leaned back again. "All right, Captain, keep flying, but understand something. The moment I think you're compromised physically, mentally, emotionally, I will pull you. No questions, no appeals, understood?" "Understood, sir." "Dismissed." Renata stood, saluted, and left the office. And as she walked back to the flight line, she felt the weight of his words settle over her like a second skin. He was watching her now. They all were. And the margin for error, which had always been razor-thin, had just gotten even thinner. But she didn't stop flying. She couldn't. Winter came to Afghanistan like a thief, stripping the mountains of color and wrapping the valleys in a cold so sharp it felt like breathing glass. The missions didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. The enemy knew that visibility was lower, that helicopters struggled in the thin air, that fast movers couldn't loiter as long. They pushed harder, attacked more frequently, and the tempo of operations increased until there wasn't a day that passed without someone somewhere calling for air support. And Widow answered. Every single time. She flew through snowstorms that would have grounded commercial aircraft. She flew through mountain passes where the clouds hung so low she navigated by instruments and memory. She flew through nights so dark that the only light came from the muzzle flashes below and the glow of her cockpit displays. And she flew through exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead and her vision blur at the edges. But she never missed a target, never failed a mission, never let anyone down. The other pilots started to talk, not about her skill, that was undeniable now, but about the cost, about the way she looked when she came back from missions, pale and hollow-eyed, like she'd left something of herself in the sky, about the way she isolated herself, avoiding the camaraderie that kept everyone else sane, about the way she seemed to be burning through herself, one mission at a time, until there'd be nothing left but smoke and memory. Captain Thorne tried to reach out, caught her one evening after a debrief and suggested they grab a coffee, talk shop, maybe decompress a little. Renata had looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite annoyance and said, "I appreciate it, but I'm fine." "You don't look fine," Thorne said, and immediately regretted it. Renata's jaw tightened. "I'm fine," she repeated, and walked away before he could say anything else. Thorne watched her go and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Concern, maybe, or recognition, because he'd seen that look before. He'd seen it in the mirror years ago, when he'd been flying too hard and pushing too far and telling himself that he was fine right up until the moment he wasn't. He made a mental note to keep an eye on her, to be there if she needed someone, but he didn't push, because pushing someone like Renata Kovac was a good way to make her shut down completely. So he waited, and watched, and hoped she'd figure it out before it was too late. The breaking point came in mid-December, on a mission that should have been routine. A patrol had reported movement in a village near the border, and intelligence suggested it might be a high-value target, a mid-level commander coordinating attacks across the region. The patrol was small, mobile, and well hidden, and the plan was simple: observe, confirm, and call in air support if needed. It was needed. The patrol spotted the target entering a compound in the center of the village, and within minutes the area was swarming with armed fighters. Too many to engage on the ground, too close to civilians to call in artillery. It had to be air, it had to be precise, and it had to be widow. Renata launched within minutes, flying through twilight that painted the world in shades of gray and purple. She reached the village just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and she circled high, studying the layout through her targeting pod. The compound was in the middle of a dense cluster of buildings, with narrow streets and civilians moving through the area. One wrong shot, and she'd kill innocents. One miscalculation, and she'd blow the mission and destroy any chance of capturing or killing the target. The patrol gave her the grid, marked the building with a laser, and Renata lined up her shot, her finger hovering over the trigger, her mind running through every variable, every angle, every possible outcome. Then the target moved, stepped out of the compound and into the street surrounded by fighters, and Renata had a choice. She could take the shot, drop a maverick into the crowd and eliminate the target along with everyone around him, or she could wait, hope for a better opportunity, risk losing him. She waited. The target moved through the village and Renata followed, orbiting overhead, her fuel gauge dropping, her ammunition ready, her hands steady on the controls. She waited for the moment, the perfect moment, the one where she could take the shot without collateral damage, without killing civilians, without compromising everything she believed in. But the moment never came. The target entered another building, this one even more densely packed with civilians, and Renata's window closed. The patrol called it off, said they'd try again another day. And Renata pulled up, climbed out of the area, and flew back to base with a full loadout and an empty feeling in her chest. She landed in silence, shut down her aircraft, climbed out of the cockpit, and stood on the flight line staring at nothing while the ground crew moved around her like she wasn't there. Captain Thorne found her there an hour later, still standing, still staring, and he didn't say anything. He just stood next to her, hands in his pockets, and waited. Finally Renata spoke. "I had the shot." "I know," Thorne said. "I could have taken him out." "You could have." "But I didn't." "No," Thorne agreed, "you didn't." Renata turned to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Did I make the right call?" Thorne considered the question, then he nodded. "Yeah, you did." "Then why does it feel like I failed?" "Because you care," Thorne said simply, "and that's what makes you good at this." Renata didn't reply. She just looked back at her aircraft, its wings heavy with unused ordnance, and felt the weight of every decision she'd ever made press down on her shoulders. Thorne stayed with her until the sun set completely, and then he walked her back to her quarters, made sure she ate something, and left her alone with her thoughts. That night Renata sat on the edge of her bunk and finally let herself feel the exhaustion, the fear, the doubt, all the things she'd been pushing down, ignoring, pretending didn't exist, And for the first time in months, she wondered if she could keep doing this, if she should keep doing this, if there was anything left of herself to give. The answer came the next morning when the radio crackled to life with another call for help. Another patrol in trouble, another impossible situation. And Renata stood, put on her flight suit, and walked to the flight line without hesitation. Because that's what Widow did. That's who she was. And she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while people were still counting on her. The mission was a fire base on the edge of collapse. 20 soldiers holding a position against an enemy force 3 times their size, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting. The firebase commander had called for help 4 times in the last hour, his voice growing more desperate with each transmission, and every time the response had been the same. No assets available. Helicopters were grounded by weather. Artillery was out of range. Fast movers were committed elsewhere. Then Widow checked in. The commander's relief was audible even through the static. Widow 1-1, Outpost Vega, thank God. We need immediate suppression of enemy positions to our north and east. Danger close. I say again, danger close. Renata didn't hesitate. Copy Vega. Mark your position with IR strobes. I'm inbound. She came in low, skimming the ridgelines, her eyes locked on the thermal display that showed the firebase as a small cluster of heat signatures surrounded by a sea of hostiles. The enemy had committed everything. Fighters with machine guns, RPGs, mortars. They were pushing hard, trying to overwhelm the position before reinforcements arrived, and they were close. Too close. Renata rolled in on her first pass and opened up with the GAU-8, walking the fire across the enemy line with a precision that defied logic. The rounds tore through flesh, stone, and earth, and the enemy wavered. She pulled up, banked hard, and came back around, this time with rockets, saturating the northern approach with high explosive fury. Then she did it again, and again, and again. For 20 minutes, she circled that firebase like a guardian angel, raining destruction on anything that moved outside the perimeter. Her fuel was critical. Her ammunition was nearly gone, but she didn't leave. She stayed until the enemy broke, retreated, and disappeared into the mountains. When the firebase commander keyed his mic, his voice was shaking. Widow 1-1, you just saved our lives, all of us. Renata's reply was soft, almost tired. Just doing my job, Vega, stay safe. She landed with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining and bullet holes in her left wing that made the crew chief curse under his breath. But she didn't care about the damage, didn't care about the fuel. She just cared that the firebase was still standing and the soldiers inside were still alive. That night, Lieutenant Colonel Hale called her back into his office. He didn't sit down, didn't ask her to sit. He just stood behind his desk, arms crossed, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Captain Kovac, he said, I'm pulling you from flight status. Renata felt the floor drop out from under her. Sir, you've flown 53 missions in 9 months. You've logged more combat hours than pilots with 3 times your experience. You've taken fire on nearly every sortie, and you're running on fumes. Hale's voice softened slightly. You're not being punished. You're being protected from yourself. Renata wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she was fine, that she could keep going, that people needed her. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down she knew he was right. She was exhausted, burned out, one bad decision away from a mistake that could kill her or someone else. She nodded once slowly, yes, sir. Hale studied her for a moment, then sighed. Take 2 weeks, rest, decompress, and when you come back we'll talk about what's next. Yes, sir. Renata left his office and walked back to her quarters in a daze. For the first time in 9 months she had nothing to do, no mission to plan, no aircraft to prep, no call to answer, and the silence was deafening. She spent the first 3 days sleeping, the next 3 days walking the perimeter of the base, trying to make sense of what she was feeling, and the last week sitting in her room, staring at the walls, and wondering if she'd lost the only thing that defined her. But on the 13th day, something changed. A knock on her door. When she opened it, she found Captain Thorne standing there with a folder in his hand. "You need to see this," he said. Inside the folder were letters, dozens of them, from the SEALs in the canyon, from the convoy commander, from the SF team on the ridgeline, from the firebase at Outpost Vega, from soldiers, Marines, airmen, and officers she'd never met but whose lives she'd saved. Every letter said the same thing in different words. "Thank you. You gave us a second chance. You brought us home." Renata read every one, and when she finished, she set the folder down, looked at Thorne, and felt something inside her shift. "I'm not done," she said quietly. Thorne smiled. "I didn't think you were." 2 weeks later, Renata Kovac returned to flight status, but this time she flew differently, not recklessly, not desperately, but with a clarity that came from understanding her purpose. She wasn't flying to prove herself. She wasn't flying to escape her past. She was flying because people needed her, and that was enough. Over the next 6 months, Widow became more than a call sign. It became a symbol, a promise. And when the war finally ended and the troops came home, Renata Kovac walked away from the cockpit with a distinguished flying cross, 2 air medals, and the quiet knowledge that she'd done something that mattered. She never sought recognition, never wanted fame. But years later, when a young pilot asked her what it was like to be a legend, Renata smiled and said the only thing that felt true: "I was just a pilot who showed up." And maybe that's all any legend really is. Someone who shows up when it matters most.